Hey YouTube, it's Justin. One of the questions that you might wonder is what happens with all of this data? Like, people are coming to your site and they're probably looking at things and you want to start to better understand what they're looking at. Now, you can use third-party tools such as Google Analytics, but you're actually giving them a lot of this very rich data. This data that you might use to transform your service, or just want to keep it in-house and you don't want to necessarily give it to third parties. You want to improve your service internally, because data is becoming more and more important and more valuable to any business, let alone any given website. So the question is, why then give it to something like Google or any other third-party service that does this? That becomes a question that might go into the conversation you're having while building your web application. And of course, do what you need to do to make the best service possible. So if that means giving some of your data away, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that as long as your service and ultimately your users are benefiting from it. But for us, we want to see how we can manipulate or use this data to better understand our users and to make just a better service in general. So that's what we're going to be doing in this one. We're going to be creating custom analytics and an app specifically for that, because it's actually fairly simple, but we talk about concepts that you may have not seen before in the sense of using it this particular way. So of course, this is part of a bigger section, or this is a section part of a bigger course called e-commerce that is still coming out. All of that stuff is in the description below, so check that out and please consider subscribing somewhere around here. Thanks so much. Let's jump into it. When it comes to building web applications, a lot of times you're going to want to understand how your users use your web application to make it better. Now, one of the ways to do this is to create your own app that will handle your analytics. That's what we're going to do in this one. And I will say that if you go to the guide right here, that guide will be a great reference for you in the future to implementing your own analytics whenever you need. But what I'll also say is sometimes you might want to use third-party analytic tools, such as Google Analytics. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with using those tools. But the big key that I think is missing when using those tools is the control over all of the data. Right? So even if you get quote unquote all of the data, you still are giving a lot of control of it to Google or any other third party that you may be using. So in our case, we want to bring it and control it in our own project, and therefore we want to create our own custom analytics. And that's what this is all about, is making sure that we're tracking and monitoring some of our user behavior to gain some key insights to make our service better. That's the point, is to make our service better. And when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, you're going to want to have at least some analytics to make your service better. And in our case, we want to control those analytics, so we will use custom analytics using Django. But you also might implement something like Google Analytics, because the time it would take to actually build everything that's in Google Analytics might outweigh the cost of it. But at the very least, we want some of our core things. And then that way we might be like, hey, I want to improve upon what I've already got. So definitely take a look at that guide. You can probably go through that guide and get the majority of what's in this section. But I will say that there will be some things that are left out of that guide on purpose, so you actually see if you can even implement the things. But we will do it in the video. So even if you don't do it in the guide, you will do it through this section. So stay with us. So let's move into creating the app and crafting the model. Now, of course, we are doing this inside of our e-commerce add-ons, right? So the e-commerce course has an entire project that we build, and that's where we're going to be working in. But what we're doing can be used in pretty much any, if not all, of your projects, and the caveats we'll talk about when they come up. So let's go ahead and jump into our project we see here. And I'm going to call my app, of course, Analytics. So let's go ahead and make sure our project is activated. Oops, let's do it here. Okay. And then we'll change into the source, and then I'll just run python manage.py, start app, analytics. Okay. So like in all videos, we try to give you some extra context. So we're not just going to be doing the model, but we will also do, put it in the admin and do some things there as well, because we can give a lot more context in less time with a video. So now that we've created the app, let's go ahead and craft the model, the very first model. So we'll go ahead and import a few things here that you may not have used before, or you have. So from contrib content types dot fields, we're going to import the generic foreign key field, and from Django.contrib.contenttypes.models, we're going to import the content type. Okay, so I will explain what those things are in just a moment, but let's go ahead and make the object first, or the model first, and we're going to call it object viewed models.model. And actually, I want to import the user model as well. So we'll do from Django.conf import settings, and we'll say user equals to settings.auth user model. And of course, we're using this because that allows us to set the user model, whether it's a custom user or not. That's kind of the point. Okay, so we'll do the user, and we're going to set it to a foreign key of user. And I'll even say blank equals to true and null equals to true. Now, the reason for this, of course, is if my user is not logged in, I still want to capture if there's been some authentication. So that probably means I want to put in an IP address, right? So I probably want to get that IP address. So I'm not going to do that quite yet, but I do want to add it eventually. The next thing is content type, and this is models.foreignKey. Content type. Again, we'll explain that in just a moment. Object ID, same thing, models.positive. In this case, it's positive integer field. So it has to be a positive integer field. It has to be a positive number. And the point of both of these things is to really get the object. So content type and object ID have to do with getting any object or any random model that we may have, right? So in my case, I have a product model, but I also have like this model itself, but I also have, let's say, a order model and a cart model and like an address model. I have all these different models. And instead of declaring the model itself, like each model, or the instance itself, so in the case of the user, this is like the actual user instance, right? So we actually set a specific user to this view, if there is one, of course. Whereas down here, we set the model type, or whatever the class is of that particular thing. So, I mean, this could even be user, right? It could be any of them. It's any of our models, basically. And then from here, this is the object ID. So the instance .id, that's what this is going to be. So it's going to be user ID or product ID or order ID. And what that does is it allows us to call something called content object, which then is our generic foreign key. And that takes in content type as well as object ID. So I can call this field then and actually get the instance. So that I can get the product instance, assuming that this one was set to a product and a product ID. This gives me that product instance. So this is like literally three fields to do the same thing as one field. So let's do the product example for a moment. I'm not going to actually save it this way, so you don't have to copy what I'm doing. So if I did product here, and I stored a product with the ID of 1. So I have a product ID equaling to 1. That will link this object view to that one specific product. And then there's a reverse relationship. So on that product, so let's say product object, I can actually get object viewed set.all. So there's this sort of reverse relationship between the two. From one direction, I can get the product instance, so the ID. From the other direction, from the product, I can get the object viewed set, and I can get the reverse. This doesn't do it. It's not that convenient to do it, but we actually don't need to worry about that too much. What we are worrying about is the actual views. We want to see the count and then possibly what type it is. It's not even completely important to have these three things. You could use something like a URL. So like, let's say, for instance, we just wanted to do a URL field. We would put that in there and just get rid of all of the foreign keys. I don't want to do that. I want direct objects that I'm looking at, so I can do all sorts of other things with it. Now the question is, like, why wouldn't I do product or then let's say, for instance, order? Like, why wouldn't I just have a bunch of foreign keys in here for each different model? Well, you could do it that way, but then it starts to get very big of a model itself. It starts to get complicated as well, because if you create a new model or a new app with a new model, you will have to remember, oh, I got to update my object viewed. I'd have to change this model to adjust to these new models. With this, I don't have to do that. I don't have to change it at all, and I don't have to worry about whether or not there's an URL to it. I just have to worry about that there is a actual content type, or the model name basically, and I have to make sure that there's an instance, and that's all I have to worry about. So it's really a lot more flexible doing it this way, although maybe a little bit harder to understand. And hopefully that cleared it up a little bit for you. Okay, but even more, we'll clear it up in just a moment, so you can see that even in the admin itself. So this is not all I want. I'm actually gonna get rid of these comments. I also want to get the timestamp. So this is also fairly important because this is analytics, right? I definitely want to know when this happens, when this view actually happens. So we'll say auto now add equals to true. So last thing is just bringing back in that IP address. For now, I'm going to put it in as a char field. There is an IP field, but I want to have it in as a char field because of how different systems bring in different IP addresses. I don't want to have to worry about the permissions and the validators on this IP address. I don't want to have to worry about it at all, so I'm just using a character field to handle it. Again, there is an IP field. Just look it up on Django. Django's documentation. But again, I don't want to worry about any validators on here. I just want it to work or not work. And that's that. Okay, so now I've got my object viewed item here. There is, of course, going to be the str method or the Unicode if you're on using Windows, or excuse me, Python 2. And then you can return, whatever sort of thing that you want here. I'm just going to say %s viewed %s as in some string substitution, and just do self.content object and self.timestamp. Okay. So that's just, you can definitely update like how that is rendered, but we'll just keep it like that. And I'll do class meta. This is also a little important for us in the future. I'll show you why when we get there. But we're going to do timestamp, and then I'm going to just add a verbose name equaling to object viewed, and verbose name plural. Oops, plural. There we go. Object and viewed, or objects viewed. Okay. So the ordering being the reverse timestamp, basically saying that it's going to say most recent saved show up first. That's all. Okay, so we've got our model. Let's go ahead and add it into our settings module. And we're going to come in here right underneath addresses and put in analytics. And we'll run our migrations now. So python manage.py, make migrations. And python manage.py, migrate. Okay, so let's add this model into our admin and take a look at it. So we'll go from.models, import object view, admin.site.register, object viewed. Okay, so let's run our server. I'm going to actually open up a new window here to make sure I have, so I can do more commands. This is essentially it. And run the server. Okay, very good. And let's go into the admin. Take a look. We've got object viewed here. Obviously, there should be none. If I click on this, now I can see the magic of content type. See how I have all of these different models in here, including the Django models, right? So I have my user model, my address model, my cart model, my order model, everything. Even the object viewed, even this current model. And then I can just put in an ID. So let's just show you an example. So if I did my hello@teamcfe user, and that user looked at a product, and the product ID was 1, and I hit save and add another, I'll do the same thing. And this time I'll do product ID of 2, hit save. Now it shows me, oh, well, one of them actually exists. So it says t-shirt viewed on, and the other one says none. Well, why does it say none? Well, if we look at our products, we can see if there is a 2. So if I click on here and just change this ID to 2, yeah, I don't have a product there. So going back into object viewed, let's change it to like 4. I hit save, and now I have 2 products viewed here. And that is actually the product instance. That's why it's showing the name. It's showing that string data that's coming from the product itself, right? So clicking on these products, it's showing this. That's where, back in the model, that's what this is doing. It's getting the actual object that we associated up here. And it does it either gets that object or it returns none, which is really nice. It doesn't actually return an error, which could potentially happen with foreign keys. You might get an error if you try to set something that doesn't actually exist, right? Hopefully that makes sense. Like if you're doing a foreign key and you're trying to set it to a user that doesn't exist, there should be an issue. And that has to do a lot with that reverse relationship stuff. This doesn't have that same sort of reverse relationship. So we now have an ability to save object viewed. Now, we want to do a couple things prior to actually implementing this. One of them is, how do we actually get this IP address? Now, I think this is analytic data, right? Hopefully you do too. So we'll actually make that in the next one. It's really, really simple, so it's going to be quick. So stay with us. So when it comes to monitoring our user data, a lot of times we want to get the IP address of our users. This is more of a unique identifier to that user than anything. Now, I will say that getting their IP address is sometimes a little tricky because of how your server might be set up. So your server might be set up incorrectly, or it might strip these headers for these IP addresses. The other side of it is that users sometimes have ways of changing their IP addresses specifically so they're not tracked. That's another part of this. So we're not so concerned with getting this 100% accurate. There's probably a way to improve this, but it's something that I think works good enough for getting our IP address working here on a lot of servers, at least on that portion. Like we can't really control how our users do things, but at least our IP address can control things to some degree. Okay, so let's go ahead and create one. I'm going to go in my analytics app, and I'm going to make a utilities function in here, or a utilities module rather. And it's really simple. It's just going to be called define get client IP, client as in the requested user's IP address. And we're going to do something like x forwarded 4, and it's request.meta.get, and this is HTTP x underscore forward x forwarded 4, and then if this exists, then we're going to say IP equals to x forwarded 4 dot split comma and 0. This is just a method to grab that IP address. Otherwise, we're going to do IP equals to request.meta.get remote add. And then we're going to return that IP. Okay, so again, a very simple method on getting this. It comes in from the actual request. as you can see here, if these headers aren't there, yeah, there's a chance that we might not get the IP address either. So there are several different ways on how this might have an issue. So going back into our model, we can now do something with getting this IP address. Like we can actually get it somehow. Before we can actually get it though, I want to create the signals and custom view mixins to make it happen. So we'll see what that means in just a moment. Stay with us. If you've been working through this project with us, you'll know about the concept of signals. These are built-in methods that allow us to do stuff when other things happen. So it's literally what it sounds like. When something happens, it sends out a signal, and then we can create receivers all around our site to handle those signals. Now we use some of the built-in Django ones, like this pre-save signal, and then we make a receiver that will handle the data that is being sent through that signal. So what we want to do is create our own custom signal, something similar to pre-save, but for us, it's going to be about the object being viewed. So essentially, it'll be sent every time an object is viewed. We'll send a signal instead of actually going off of the model. So we're not going to create the model from the view, right? So like I'm not going to import this model into different views. Instead, what I'm going to do is import a signal that will be sent every time any sort of object is viewed on our site. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and make a new module called signals. And it's really simple actually. So we'll do from Django.dispatch import signal. And then we'll just call it object viewed signal. And it's going to send signal with providing arguments equaling to a string, and we're going to do instance and request. So any given object instance, so like the product object with the title of t-shirt and an ID of 1, that is the instance we'll send through, and then we'll also even send through the actual request that's happening. Hopefully, if you watch the last one, you understand why we might be sending that request in. And a little hint, it has something to do with the client IP. So now that we've created this signal, we can actually do all sorts of things to work with this signal. So let's go ahead and grab it. And I'm going to go into my product views here. So I have these detail views. I have a detail view that actually has a get object method, right? So on here, there's a method called get object. And that's true with all sorts of places where there actually is an object. Now, the list view, the product list view, is not the same, right? So we are doing literally when an object is viewed, not when a page is viewed. If it was when a page is viewed, then you would just put it on every view or every page. You would probably do something very similar to this and then just get the path or something like that. But we're not doing that. We're doing it when any particular object is viewed. So in the case of a detail item being viewed or a detail slug being viewed, this is where we're actually going to end up doing it. So how do we go about it? Well, I'm going to show you one quick example of how you can just do it from here, and that is importing the signal to our view. We can go ahead and say from analytics dot signals import this object view signal, and then scroll down to wherever that object being viewed would be. So right here, it's the product detail slug view. I can actually bring in this signal and do send. And the first thing is we have to add in a sender. Now, you are hopefully already familiar with this because in our signal for pre-save, we have a sender. We added our own arguments to be passed. One of them was instance, the other one was request. So we're going to be working towards something very similar to this. But that very first thing we have to do in that view is have a sender. In this case, our sender is the actual instance. So let's actually bring this down here where it's after our instance has been declared. And assuming that there wasn't a 404 error, we can do instance dot underscore underscore class. So this is the actual sender. It's the sender of this view is the class. So this class will come through with our signal in addition to the providing arguments that we named, which was instance. So we'll say instance equals to instance and request equals to request, right? So all of those things are set up, and this will run just fine. Like, you'll actually send out this signal, and then we'll be able to map into this signal. But this, as you may see, can be a little bit redundant. Like, I might have to rewrite this over and over again. Now, if you're using function-based views, you will have to do this over and over again. If you're using class-based views, and more specifically class-based generic views, much like this detail view here, we can actually make something called a Mixin that will handle this for us, which is great. So that's what we'll do now. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out, and let's go ahead and make our own Mixin. Now, we want to create a custom view Mixin specifically for class-based views, so we don't have to be too redundant. And also, if something changes in our signal, we only have to go to one place then. Well, we would have to go to two places. We'd change it in the signal, and then we would want to change it in the Mixin that we're about to create. So back into our analytics app, we're going to make a new file here and call it mixins.py. And all we're going to do is import from signals, import the object viewed signal, right? So it's this signal right here. We're bringing it into this object viewed signal, and then we'll do class object view or object viewed Mixin, and it takes an object as an argument. What we're going to do here is define get context data. It's going to take in self, args, and keyword args. We want to get the default context of whatever class this is going to be inheriting from. We'll see what this means once we put it in the actual view itself. So the superclass, self, and then dot get context data, args, and keyword args. And I want to define the request equaling to self.request. And then I also want to get the object. So the instance is equal to the context object. And then I can just return context. But inside of this return, I'm going to send my signal. So we'll do send, and again, it's instance.class, and instance equals to instance, and then request equals to request. Now, of course, I also want to say, let's instead of doing that, we'll just get the object, and then we'll say if instance, then we'll run that actual call. So basically, if I accidentally put this Mixin somewhere else, it's not going to run into any errors. So if the instance or the object exists in the context, then we'll run this. Now, I'm just going to copy and paste some code here and show you that, yeah, you could do this other places, right? So if I did dispatch instead, I could do something like this. But the problem that I think with this is you're running this get object method again, which given any given view, we might have to we're like calling this all over again. And we don't need to do that. So instead, I'm just going to go off of the context data, because we know for sure, no matter what actual detail view it is, it's going to get that object data. And if it doesn't have an object, then it's not going to run that signal. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this here. And now we're going to bring this object viewed Mixin into any given object view. So let's go ahead and do that. And now instead of analytics signals, we'll do Mixins, and then we'll just import this Mixin. I deleted that other one already. And I'm going to put this into every detail view that I see. Okay, and detail view. Or I should say every detail view that I see, but also every detail view that I actually want to get the analytic data for it. Okay, so now that I've got this going, I have to move on to the next step, which is actually handling the viewed signal. So handling that in our model. So there is possibility that things will break. And if they do, we will fix them when they break, although the guide itself will not be broken. It will be updated to account for any sort of changes that happen in the video. but there is a good chance, or not a good chance, but there is a chance that some of these things might break, because that's what happens with code. That's why we test it. That's why we go through it step by step as well. All right, so let's hook it in just a moment. So now it's time to handle the object viewed signal. We have our mixin, we have our signal, we have now a way to actually work with this data. So let's go ahead and jump into our model, our analytic model here. And we're going to go and import the signal itself. So we need to connect to it. So we have to import it. So from signals, import the object viewed signal. And then down here, we're going to create a receiver function for it. So the first thing is define get object or object viewed receiver. And it's going to take in sender. Well, what are the other arguments that are being passed? Well, those are these arguments right here, instance and request. So instance and request. Those are the arguments that are passed. There are other things that might be passed by default, so we're going to do args and keyword args to catch those things. So now we should be able to see the actual sender. We should be able to see the instance. And we should be able to see the request and also the requested user, if there is one. So that's how our receiver is going to work. So let's just connect it to our signal. So signal.connect, and we put in our receiver. Notice I don't have to write out sender equals to here because I actually sent the sender along with the actual signal itself. So let's try this out. So hopefully now we're not going to run into any errors, but instead we're going to print out this data when we actually look at something. So let's go into our products, into a product, and what do you know? I don't have errors, but what I do have is 3 separate things. I have a class of product, I have an instance, which in this case is t-shirt, and then I get a request data information. So what does that mean? Well, first and foremost, I can now create an object viewed item. So I'll say new view obj equals to object viewed dot objects dot create, and we're going to do a few things. First of all, the user equals to the request that user. That's fairly straightforward. We've seen that before. The next, I want to get my IP address. So let's go bring that in from the utility function here. So from .utils, or utility method, that is, or module, excuse me, and then we'll go ahead and just say IP address equals to that of the request. Okay. There's possibly a chance this will be none, but let's just double check in our utility function here. I'm going to go ahead and say that if that's not there, I'll just add none here. Just a little improvement on that. Okay, so now going back into our model, we have 2 of the things done that we sort of expect. Well, how do we do the content type itself, right? I can actually get the object ID. That's fairly straightforward, and that would be coming in here and saying object ID equals to instance.id. But what about the content type? How do I actually get a content type of any given class? Well, this is actually fairly simple. We say content type equals to content type class, or let's call this C type, as to not confuse the variable with the class itself. So the foreign key, we've already imported it, and then we'll do .objects.get for model of the sender. So the class that's coming through is that sender. Now, of course, that is the same thing as instance.class. We've actually already seen that. So that gives us the class that is coming through. It gives us the same, in the case of object viewed, it would give us that object viewed class. And this gives us that content type. So we can actually set it down here for content type. And then there you go. That actually is how we create that actual object viewed. So let's comment out these print statements here. Save it. And let's go ahead and try it out. I'll refresh in here a couple times. I'll look at a few other products. All right. Cool. Looked at a few things. Let's go into the admin. Let's look at our viewed items. And there you go. We now have a way to store and save viewed items. Pretty easy and, well, definitely doable, right? Hopefully like none of this was like really outside the realm of possibility for you. The new things might have been the signal and possibly even getting the IP address. But in my case, this is how it worked, and it worked just fine. Okay, cool. So the IP address is definitely something that you'll probably want to keep. You don't want to actually publicly have it out there because you probably don't want to give away the IP addresses of all of your users. So if you're worried about security at all, that might be something that you just completely scrape from this. One of the advantages, though, and please let me know in the comments, but one of the advantages of getting their IP address is you can actually parse that IP address and get their location without requesting it, right? So it's going off of their IP address, so it's not perfectly accurate like a browser sort of request might be, but it actually does do that. So that's something else that's kind of cool about this, and that might be something you put in your terms of use on your website that, hey, we get your client IP address when you use this site. You probably need to put that on there, but again, those are legal things that I just don't know that much about. Okay, so now I'm going to stop for just a moment. We will actually do this in the video, but it's not in the guide, and I want to leave you with a challenge. So if I was you, I would stop right now and try to actually get a user's session. Like, how do you actually grab their session, or more specifically, their session ID, and store it in such a way that's similar to what we did here? Like, how would you go about doing that? That's something we will absolutely do. But again, it's not in the guide, and I do encourage you to think through this now. One hint I'll give you is there actually is a session model, much like the content type or any models that we've created. There is a session model for your users. It's just a matter of how do you actually correlate those things. There's a lot of it right in front of you right here with this object view. So the challenge shouldn't be impossible to get, but it is a challenge nonetheless. So go ahead and try that out. For those of you who are done with it or don't feel like doing it, stay with us because we'll actually solve that in just a moment. So now what we're going to do is take everything we learned from the object viewed items to creating a user session model. So it's very, very similar to this, but it's basically getting the session key for any given user, and we can monitor what those sessions are going to be. So that means that we have to create the model, we have to make a signal, and we have to hook these things in somehow. So the first thing that I'm going to do is actually import a couple things. So we'll do from django.contrib.sessions.models import session. And I also, this should be a capital S there. I also am going to reorganize some stuff. And then from django.db.models.signals import pre-save and post-save. Okay. So the next thing is I want to actually create, or the first thing that I want to do is actually create a signal for my user logged in. So in my case, I have some login stuff, so login view here, but this is all my own custom login view. You might be using a third-party package, and there might be a good chance that they have a user logged in signal built into it. But in our case, we're going to create our own user logged in signal. So basically, after the user logs in, we want to have some sort of signal so we can connect to it. Now, this is great for our user session, but it's also great for other things that you may want to use that information for. So in our accounts app, we're going to go in here and do signals.py, and I'm going to copy everything that I've already done. And I'm going to call this user logged in. And really all it takes in is the request. So it's going to take in the request and probably even the user itself. So after the user logs in, it's probably going to also take in that as the sender. So the actual user class that is. And then other than that, it's just the request. Okay, so where would we put this? I'm going to go into my view for login. and just put it in here. So after I log in, so from .signals, import user logged in signal. And literally after this, or before that redirect, I'm just going to do user logged in .send, and the sender in my case will be user.class. And then the actual request is going to be what's sent in. You know what? We might as well send in the actual user itself. So we'll say instance equals to user. So the actual user instance, very, very similar to what we've already done. So that means I just need to change my signal a little bit and say instance here. Okay, so we've got our logged in signal going, and it'll absolutely run. So that means back in my analytics, I can now start to create something with that. So before I do, I'm going to go ahead and import from accounts.signals, import user logged in signal. And then we'll scroll down here. And I'm going to do define user logged in receiver, and the sender instance request args keyword args. Okay, so the user's logged in. I can do something with this user being logged in, and we'll go ahead and see what that is in maybe just a moment. So I'll just say print out the instance or the user. And then we'll just do user logged in, connect, and there we go. Okay, so now we need to actually create our model for any given user session. So we'll do class, and I'll say user session, and it's going to be models.model. The reason I'm not calling it session itself has to do with this right here. We don't want to call it session because the built-in Django model is called session. So I'll leave it in as this, and then I'm going to virtually copy the object view. The reason I said that it's very similar because it's almost identical with the exception of a couple things, and that is these right here. I don't actually need those things. Instead, what I need is just the session key, and we'll do models.char field. Max length, I think we're good if we do 100. We're probably good beyond that too, or a little bit less than that. I think you need to have a minimum of 50. I think that's right. You can look up the documentation for that one. And then we need two more things here. So we've got a user. We can do an IP address again, and we can get a session key and stuff like that. So the reason we would do the IP address is to track the data between the user session IP address and then an object viewed. And if it's the same user, there might be some conflicts or some things that we want to implement to prevent those things from happening. So there's a couple things that I do want to have in here. One of them being active, and we'll say models.boolean field and default being true. So whether or not this is an active session, should we keep it active or not? Oops. There's that idea. And then we want to say if it's ended. So this is more referring to if we manually end this session, I'll give a default of false. And then we're going to do our str method. If we wanted to, I'll just leave it like this. Okay. And then now that we've got this, I can actually create this. So let's go ahead and do our make migrations. Python manage.py, make migrations. Looks like keyword argument is repeated. Oops, that's this. So we need this to be blank. Try that again. Contrib dot sessions. Oops, there we go. So that's the import right there. Make migrations. There we go. And then Python manage.py, migrate. Of course, we haven't used that session model just yet because we're actually going to be storing the key, much like we stored the object ID up here. We're just going to be storing the key down here. Okay, so after the user logs in, we now want to create one of these user sessions. So this is where we will actually get the session ID. With every request, we can say session key equals to request.session.session key. This is true as of Django 1.11. It might change the location, but that is true, and that should be true for a while, actually. And again, we can get the IP address from that request, much like we did here. Okay. And then the user is the instance, right? So who's being passed. Okay. And now we just create a new session. So user session dot objects dot create. And what do we create? We say user equals to user. The IP address equals to the IP address. The session key equals to the session key. And of course, the left-hand side of this are the keyword arguments, or the arguments, also known as these things. The right-hand side are the variables inside of this method here. So that creates our actual session, and it will store it into the database. So before we actually finish this off, though, is I want to make sure that I can end sessions, that is, remove them altogether. So to do this, we have to create some sort of method that will actually go about ending these sessions. Before I do that, I will bring this into my analytics, though. Admin, or sorry, not into the analytics, but the admin. Okay, so we now have our session here, and let's go ahead and take a look. Let's log out, log in, and we have to log in with our new one. Okay, let's go into the admin, user sessions. I got a session object. Notice my IP address is incorrect, but it gives me a session key, which is nice. So how do I actually end that session? Well, let's just do it in the shell real quick. So Python manage.py shell, and I'll say session key equals to that string. And then I'll do the import or the session model import, that is, and just do session.objects.get. And this is going to be, we want to get the actual key itself, which is coming off of the primary key. So this is the session primary key, and we have that object. And then if I just do .delete and refresh here, what do you know? I have to log in again. So that is how I can go about managing and deleting these sessions, which is really cool. So that means in here, I can say define and end session, take in self, and really, I'm just going to grab that session key again. So session key equals to self.sessionKey. And then we'll just go ahead and do try session.objects.get pk, or primary key, is equal to the session key. And then we'll do .delete. And let's say ended equals to false. And then if it works there, we'll say ended equals to true. Or rather, we'll say ended equals to self.ended. And now we'll say self.ended inside of this try block, self.ended equals to true, and self.save. And then we'll return self.ended. And also we might want to put self.active being false. Okay, really simple way to end that session. But what I want to do also is, if I change this from being active, I want to just run that in session portion. And I might also want to have a way that if this is created, that I delete any of my other sessions. So I only have one session actually in use. Now, the requirement of one session is probably not as big of a deal for something like e-commerce, but it might be a big deal for other sorts of things. So to do this, we're going to create our receiver function. So I'll just say the post save receiver, and it's going to take in sender, instance, args, and keyword args. Actually, we also want created in here. So we'll say if created. Then I want to get all of my other user sessions. So I'll say QS equals to user session dot objects dot filter, and we'll say instance, or sorry, filter by user equals to instance dot user, and then we're just going to exclude PK ID equals to instance dot ID. And then for I in QS, I.end session. And that's it. So that's saying one, right? So like every other session that might be in there, as soon as they're logged in, it's going to go ahead and end that session for us. Really simple. Then finally, we just do postsave.connect and this receiver. Well, let's call it postsave session receiver. Sender equals to user session. Okay, so we will try this out now. I'm going to go ahead and log in with my session here. I log in. Oh, nope, that's actually not where I want to log in. The Django admin, it won't work on that. I think there might be a signal somewhere for that, but we want to log in to our main site where we actually call that signal. So I run that. Okay, great. Now let's go into an incognito window and try it again. And I'll do hello at TeamCFE, the password, login, and then I'll refresh here. Yes, I'm out. I'm gone. Cool. So I'm not going to do it, but the last challenge would be, how do I have multiple sessions? Like, let's say, for instance, I have a max session. How do you go about doing that? It's actually very similar to this. I will say one more thing is with this filter, you might want to say ended equals to false and active equals to false, just to make sure we're not always going through everything that is related to this user's session. That's probably a little key thing there. But in general, how do we go further? How do we say, oh, I want to allow them to have, let's say, 5 sessions, and anything beyond 5, how do I update this receiver function to handle that? But that's it. That's handling user sessions and even forcing logouts. There might be one thing too that you would want to do in this. Let's say, for instance, a pre-save, and we'll do pre-save session receiver. And it's going to take in sender and instance. Or, well, actually, we won't do the pre-save. We'll leave it in as a post-save. And basically, we want to say if not instance active and not instance dot ended, then I'll just do instance dot end session. So this won't create a loop because we end the session here, and basically saying if this is true, then this is not this won't work. Or sorry, yeah, if not false, so this would be false. And if this is false, so if this is false and this is false, then we'll end the session. But one of these will be true. So they're sort of the opposites of each other, right? No matter where we set them, they are the opposites of each other. And then we would go ahead and end that session. So that means that in the admin, I can also end that session as well, which let's go ahead and try that out. I'm going to log into the admin, and I'm going to log in as this user. So if I look back here, I'm still logged in, right? Because I logged into the admin and that signal wasn't called. So I can go into that session and hit active, hit save, session object changed successfully, refresh in here, they're gone. And of course, from there, you can then deactivate the user and do all sorts of stuff with that. Like you could even go even further and say, oh, I want to have a post-save user. This is going way too far, but let's just do it real quick. And I'll say post-save user changed receiver. And we'll do define that. This, I think, is actually also fairly important. So we say sender instance created, and then args, keyword args, and we'll say if not created. So this user was not created just now. What I want to do is say if instance dot is active equals to false, then I want to get all of my query set items here and end their sessions. So all of them that are not ended, basically, let's end all of those sessions because I just said, hey, this user is no longer active. And then that means that all of their sessions should end immediately. This is just like a nice fail-safe that you might end up wanting to implement. I'm not going to implement it because I actually don't need that here. It's much more about learning and understanding this stuff. And further, I'm also not going to implement this one either. I don't actually need to end anyone's session, but I will leave that code in there for you. So actually, let's do it something more like this. And I'll go in my configuration and say force session to 1 equaling to get attribute of the settings module to force session to 1, and we'll say false. And then come down here and say if force session to 1, then you'll actually connect to that stuff. And then we'll do that same thing again and force user end session inactive, or force inactive user in session. Again, I'm going to leave it as false and put that down here as well. So if that. So basically what this is doing is looking in the settings module for these two things. And then the default, if it's not there, it will just default to false. So again, I can just copy these and go into my settings module here and post in these things and just really say false on both of them and leave it as false, but just allowing you to have just a little bit better understanding of how you might go about doing these things and using it in your model. So that's it for monitoring user sessions. I realize this one was a little bit longer, but we really brought a lot of things together here in our quest for better analytics. So the last challenge that I'll leave you with that I'm actually definitely not going to do, at least not now, is how do we change our object viewed to just page views? Like how do we analyze or do analytics for any given page view? So go ahead and try that out. If you have any questions on this user session stuff, please let us know. I really actually was so stoked when I found out about how easy it is to do this stuff, and hopefully you are too. Hey, thanks so much for watching. I build everything that I can to help you guys launch your projects faster, better, and more often. So please consider subscribing. JoinCFE.com/YouTube is a quick way to our YouTube channel. JoinCFE.com/projects, and just JoinCFE.com. That is where all of our stuff is, and I really hope that you join us there as well. Thanks again so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.